Good evening.
Good evening.
Let me rush to thank the church, but also in particular Reverend Dr. Frederick, First Lady, all for the invitation. I'll be honest with you, I do not take lightly that he would invite me and entrust me with the opportunity of talking about something that is very tough issue to talk about sometimes. You can't just invite anybody to come in and talk about politics and religion. And so for you to give me that honor and entrust me with that, I do not take that lightly or take that for granted. So thank you. I also want to thank Leslie and Fred and others who encouraged the pastor to bring me in, gave him the book and told him about what the AND campaign was trying to accomplish. I greatly appreciate that. And just want to thank you all for coming out. It really is a blessing to me. There's a couple people I heard from today that said, listening to you, I've been spreading the word and talking about what you're doing. It's so excited for you to be here. And that's amazing to me because I remember the days when I was just really talking to myself, right? Or just talking to God and hoping that someone would get something out of what I was saying. Now you heard a little bit about my background. I'm an attorney, political strategist, and also a minister. And one of the reasons that I created the AND campaign is because I was running campaigns in the city of Atlanta for a long time, worked for the mayor for 8 years. And I noticed that Christians, when they enter the public square, often felt like they had to leave some of their convictions behind. So if they were on the Republican side, there was sometimes a lack of compassion, and they couldn't kind of bring some of those compassion issues to the conversation. If they're on the Democratic side, like I was, then there was often some convictions that we all know you're not supposed to talk about in polite society. And they would have to leave those aside because those convictions weren't popular among that crowd. And I remember thinking, I was a delegate at the Democratic Convention in 2016 and 2020. And I remember thinking, it's okay for Christians to be in political parties, that's not what this is about, but that we had to be distinctive in character. That if someone saw a group of Republicans talking, they could say, well, that's the Christian. If somebody saw a group of Democrats talking, they could say, you know what, that's the Christian. That we wouldn't just be camouflaged within our party. Because sometimes what can happen, and I think we probably even see this, especially during election season, is with all the pageantry and with all the rivalry, we get pulled into really allowing our party to speak for us. We end up outsourcing our public witness to our political party. But what I want you all to realize is that our public witness does not belong to any political party. Our public witness doesn't belong to conservatives or progressives. In fact, our public witness does not even belong to us. Our public witness belongs to God, which means that we have to be willing, have the courage to speak up against either side when it's outside of some of those guidelines. And rarely, and I would say this for both sides, rarely do we do that often enough, especially in these moments. Because what we do in these moments is we say, as long as we're better than them, we're okay. I just don't remember Jesus saying that. I don't remember Jesus coming in and saying, well, the Pharisees are legalistic, so let me just be a Herodian, right? Or the Sadducees lack belief, let me just be a Pharisee. And we brought something completely different to the conversation. And that's some of the things that I really want to get into today. So what I'll do is I'll give you a little bit of the AND campaign framework, not too much because I want you to read the book and I think you can get a lot out of the book, but I want you to get an understanding really of where we're coming from. And this particular framework, if you have your Bibles, you can open them up. This particular framework comes from Ephesians 4, verses 14 through 15. Ephesians 4, verses 14 through 15. And it reads, then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect, the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ, speaking the truth in love. Not just speaking the truth without compassion in any way we want to. Not just speaking love and just affirmation and coddling, but speaking the truth in love. Speaking the truth in love. In Ephesians 4, Apostle Paul is talking to the church of Ephesus. And many of you know that this was the persevering church. Ephesus had endured a lot of suffering. And they also, at this point, had a bunch of false prophets who were trying to infiltrate the church with false teaching. Now, earlier on in Ephesians, Paul is talking to them about being mature, what it means to be mature. When he talks about maturity, he's talking about growth in mind, growth in understanding, growth in knowledge of the truth, and growth in moral character. So basically what he's saying, when we become mature, when we grow in our mind, when we grow in knowledge of the truth and moral character, then we will no longer be infants. Meaning we'll no longer be so malleable, so impressionable, tossed back and forth by the waves, blown here and there by every teaching. Have you ever met someone who reads one book on one particular subject and they think they know everything about the subject? Their whole identity and opinion changes just off that one thing. Well, Christian should have a solid enough foundation that they can read something and maybe agree with it, or read something and disagree with it, right? Because they know where they're coming from. They're not just blown by what's popular or what's going on. Paul is basically saying that mature Christians are not easily deceived. That these false teachers would be able to indoctrinate mature Christians because mature Christians know what they stand for. Regardless of what false teachings are prominent, regardless of what popular opinion or conventional wisdom is saying at the moment, and here's the big one, regardless of how much they're suffering, and regardless of how nasty their opponents are, Christians will be able to speak the truth in love. Basically, that our circumstances and what's happening around us and what people are doing to us do not dictate our character. They don't dictate our public witness. Christians should never let the circumstances or the tactics of their opponent dictate who they are. Now, we're going to make this interactive. One other thing I want to say, though, is this reminds me kind of the civil rights movement. Now, everybody today wants to claim the civil rights movement. We know that in general, it was a Christian movement that worked with folks outside of Christianity to do the Lord's work. And so we talk about it a lot, but I'm not sure that everybody truly understands what was at the foundation of the civil rights movement. Yes, it was about changing policy. Yes, it was about changing systems. But I would argue that there was a guiding principle that was even more important than all those things. And the guiding principle that kept them beneath the shadow of the cross was this: that no matter how bad it got, no matter how bad you were suffering, no matter how nasty your opponents were, you could never allow them to have a negative impact on your spirit. Because you could win policy, you could win legislative battles, you could win elections, but if they had a negative impact on your spirit, then you had lost too much. So that's why they would not return evil for evil. They would not reciprocate the hate that was coming to them. So what I'm presenting you today is very much a framework. And the reason that I think we need this political framework is because most Christians who are politically engaged look at politics not necessarily as Christians, but as either Democrats or Republicans, as progressives or conservatives. In fact, I would go so far as to say that many Christians have allowed their political affiliation to become religious in nature. that if we really look at our views on moral matters and what we talk about publicly on moral matters, if our views have changed over the last 10 years, you can probably map out how they changed right along with our party. Or right along with the secular influences that we follow. If there are issues that we used to talk about, that we're quiet about, it might just be because our party, your ideological tribe, said you can't talk about that anymore. So one thing I would ask all of you to do is think about, have your views changed over time? And was it because you read the Bible differently, or you got some inspiration from the Bible? Or was it from an influencer or some political party or some politician that was telling you how you should think about it? Was it from cable news? So anybody have a thought on what type of convictions we may have that may have changed over the last 10, 15 years based on who we listen to outside the church, based on letting the talking head on MSNBC or Fox News be our pastor and disciple us sometimes more than we allowed our pastor to on that particular issue. Any ideas on what type of issues that might happen with?
Come on, y'all.
The abortion issue.
Abortion, okay. Would some of us be able to admit that maybe our ideas about that issue have changed based on what the outside world is saying? Now, in my opinion, we can get into that later. I think both sides kind of get that wrong. But one thing I know is whatever you believe on this issue, it needs to come from here. Because none of these parties, none of these ideological tribes are infallible. And we too easily slip into following others rather than really making sure that we're being discipled properly, okay? So I want to make sure that we think about that. Now, again, I'm not saying that you can't be in a political party. I think the political parties are a good tool in politics. I'm not saying that you can't lean right or left. But what I am saying is that too often, one side is either lacking in love or lacking in truth. And so while we can choose a political party, we cannot choose between love and truth. Because love and truth are not mutually exclusive. They're not at odds. The beautiful thing that the gospel does, that nothing else does, is it brings love and truth together in a beautiful tension that allows us to love people and also tell them the truth. That allows us to be compassionate and also honest. Our world tends to separate love and truth. It tends to separate social justice and moral order. In fact, if we look into the public square, usually what we see is social justice Christians over here and morality Christians over there.
Wow.
You show me where in the Bible it says that we should have two separate types of groups of Christians that just focus on those things. Because the social justice Christians don't want to talk about certain moral issues. And the morality Christians don't want to talk about certain social justice issues. Jesus talked about all of those things. So we need to think about how we combine those things. The late Tim Keller once said this. He said that love without truth is sentimentality, meaning it's overly emotional. It's lacking in substance. A Christian that goes around with just love that's affirming and coddling everything is not loving the way Jesus loved. He goes on to say that truth without love is harshness. It's mean. It's uncompassionate. A Christian that just goes around telling people what they see as the truth with no compassion for them, with no love for them, and not willing to sacrifice for them is not telling the truth in the way Jesus told the truth. And what I'm trying to tell you is if we learn how to love and learn how to tell the truth from the world instead of from Jesus, we're doing it the wrong way. You've got to think through that. Now, what I'm giving you again is a framework, a way to look at politics differently than we usually do. Now, that framework doesn't mean that we're all going to agree on every issue, but it does give us some boundaries. And so on this framework, we have the love and compassion and social justice side of it. And then we have the truth and moral order side of this framework. And first, I want to start with the love side of this framework. Now we know that we have been commanded to love our neighbors as ourselves. And we cannot do that. We cannot love our neighbors as ourselves truly if we're not willing to advocate for our neighbors' well-being and to protect their human dignity. That's really all that a biblical definition of social justice is. Now, just so you guys aren't confused, the second half of what I'm doing is going to be on those 10 disciplines, okay? The second half is going to be on those 10 disciplines. But I want to give you this framework first, and this is partially what the book is based on. All right. According to the Great Commandment, if you would want justice for yourself, if you would seek justice for yourself, then you must also seek it for who? For your neighbor. Right? That's what we should be that's what we should be thinking about when we're thinking about justice and how to engage. If we truly love our neighbors, we will be socially concerned about our neighbors. And that social concern will not be just a sentiment. It won't just be, oh, bless their hearts. We know in 1 John 3:16 that love is self-sacrifice. If you see somebody walking down the street with nothing on and they need a shirt or they need a blanket and you have one, and you say, bless your heart, I hope you're okay. According to the Bible, that's not Jesus type of love. Jesus' type of love is a self-sacrifice to put them in a better position. That's love. That's why we care about justice, because we want people held, we want people to be loved to a certain standard, even within society, to be treated with fairness. Now, we supposedly have Christians that don't believe in social justice. But I'm going to tell you a secret. I don't believe them. I think everybody believes in social justice. Some people just deny it to some people and give it to the people that it's more convenient to give it to. Here's what I mean. I don't think anybody listening to me today or any Christian in this city would let somebody they loved go to prison unjustly if there was something they could do to stop it. They wouldn't just sit there and watch that happen. And I don't think anybody listening to me today would allow the children in their neighborhood to drink lead poisoned water if there was something they could do to stop it. And why is that? It's because we believe in social justice. We believe because we all have human dignity that there's a certain standard by which no one should go below in how they're treated. That's all a biblical definition of social justice is. It's justice in the social context. Now, does that mean that everything that other people call social justice, that we might hear in academia or hear in other activist circles, does that mean that's all social justice according to a biblical definition? Not everything everybody else defines as social justice is social justice. Because social justice, again, is connected to truth. It's connected to holiness. And so anything that does not promote that does not fit within a biblical definition of what social justice is, okay? So that's the love, compassion, and social justice side of this framework. Let's get to the truth and moral order side of this. Now, in Ephesians 4:15, the term speak the truth comes from the Greek word that refers to teaching or professing the truth, usually as it relates to doctrine. Here's what I want you to really think about in this part of it. This is not subjective. Everyone does not have their own separate truth, because if everybody had their own separate truth, truth would be meaningless. To speak the truth means to profess right doctrine or to be honest in how you recount events. We worship a God of justice, absolutely. And we also worship a God of moral order. God's truth provides direction and structure in this ever-changing world. It remains unchanging. And I'm from a very urban setting, and in a lot of urban settings like Atlanta, Everyone's always trying to prove how progressive they are. Right? That's what you do today. You always trying to show, and even a lot of Christians get ourselves into trouble because we're trying to prove to our peers how progressive we are. And this is where I think being progressive can run into trouble, just like trying to be conservative can run us into trouble. First, an illustration, just to move forward. Well, let me say, let's define being progressive in general. Usually when we think about being progressive, we're talking about fixing things. We're talking about moving forward, and that's good. That's good in general, but to be progressive is not the answer, at least according to the Bible, in every situation. If you are on the edge of a cliff, to be progressive or to even lean forward wouldn't be such a good idea. It's also a bad idea to be progressive if you're already headed in the wrong direction. Sometimes God is asking us to stand firm on what his word already says, or what he's already said is good. Sometimes God is asking us to preserve things and institutions, not change them. So somebody give me an idea of something that you think God is saying, no, don't change this, preserve this. What's an institution, or what's something that God has already said is good? He said, no, I don't need you to improvise and change it. I need you to preserve it.
The Bible.
The Bible, the family, okay.
Marriage.
There are ways that we can change it that actually hurt that institution, right? We got to think about that. The way I like to think about the true side of this is, think of a masterpiece. Think of something like a Picasso, okay? Modern thought tells us that we can improve everything, but God's word can't be improved. So like a masterpiece, you can't improve a Picasso. You can only deface a Picasso. So if you go up to a Picasso or any other masterpiece and you add something to it, or you take something away from it, you have ruined it. You have not made it better. And sometimes Christians have to have the discernment that when progressives are telling us to change something that needs to be preserved, we should say, no, that's not something we change. When conservatives are telling us to keep something the same that is broken and needs to be changed, Christians have to have the discernment and the wisdom and the moral knowledge to say, no, that should not remain the same. It's broken. We need to fix it. And we need to know that we have to make that decision. We have to discern and pray through that issue by issue. The problem with conservatism and progressivism, they look at something and they say either it needs to change or it needs to stay the same, and they don't go through that type of biblical scrutiny to understand what God says needs to happen. And when Christians blindly follow behind that because the other side is bad, then we end up making mistakes that the Bible clearly tells us how to avoid. We miss God's instruction. If you think Donald Trump is really, really bad, you can say that and you might be right. It is not an excuse or a justification to do everything and go along with everything that the progressives say. If you think Kamala Harris is bad, you may be right. That's your opinion. It is not an excuse to go along with everything that the conservatives say. Christians cannot do that. Christians should be leading, not simply following. Somebody talk about a little bit situations where on both sides that Christians have followed instead of stepping to the forefront with wisdom and moral knowledge in their party and saying no. Where are some issues that we have followed rather than stepping up and leading?
Christian nationalism.
Christian nationalism. Would it be nice if more Christians on the right stood up and said, Christian nationalism is more cultural than it is Christian? Right. Christian nationalism is not biblical because the Bible doesn't tell us to force anybody to do anything. Christian nationalism is ahistorical because this country has never truly followed the Bible in that way to be considered a Christian country. But it's not just on the right. Where's some things on the left that we could say, you know, Christians should have stood up and said something about this and still should? Marriage.
Yeah.
The definition of marriage. You know, the sad thing, I have, my barber's a young guy, and I talk to him all the time. And he'll come over, cut me and my son's hair, and he'll say, he's just so interested in marriage. He's never been to a wedding. And the sad thing is, because we played with marriage so much, he doesn't even really understand what it's for. He just sees us and he sees how we interact. And he's like, that's something I want, but nobody ever taught me what it's for. Yes, marriage has a lot to do with loving somebody, but that's not the whole of marriage. And when you play with something, when you change something that God said you should preserve, you get in a situation where you lose moral order and people don't even understand what purpose it's supposed to serve. But a lot of Christians, because of what circles we're in, refuse to stand up and speak. We read the Bible and we said, when I'm in Daniel's situation, I would look at King Nebuchadnezzar, I'd do the same thing he did. If I was David, I'd do the same thing he did. If I was the Hebrew boys, I would stand up and do the same thing they did. And when it comes our time to do that on issues that our party doesn't want to talk about, we cower. We find excuses and reasons not to stand up for what we should believe. I don't want to talk about marriage because I don't want to be like those crazy conservative Christians over there, and I don't want to be mistaken for them. They didn't write the Bible. They don't own those values. You don't run away from what's right just because somebody who may be wrong on other things says the same thing. And we find ourselves in too many instances running from the one moment that God gave us to stand up and speak his word. And too easily we make excuses, mostly again, based on how bad the other side is, not to stand up for what's right. So now we're in election season. So that's the framework. And if you have questions, write them down because we'll be interacting a little more now. But I am gonna answer any questions you have about that. In fact, actually, does anybody have any questions about that now? Before we get into the 10 disciplines. So what we talked about again, we talked about a different framework, not looking at politics as primarily a Republican or primarily a Democrat, but looking at politics as a Christian. And what I want to say very clearly is that you cannot be a faithful Christian and just go along with everything conservatives say. You cannot be a faithful Christian and just go along with everything that Democrats say and progressives say. If we are progressive or conservative on every single issue at all times, then we are being intellectually lazy. That means somebody else is making these decisions and we're just going along with them. But not only are we being intellectually lazy, we are being unfaithful. Because neither conservatism or progressivism is an accurate application of the gospel. Both of those things were made by human hands. God did not come down and say, hey, conservatism is going to be the representative of me. Progressivism is going to be the representative of me. You know, he said, Jesus is my representative and my disciples are my representatives. You are my ambassadors, not some party. But too often, even within the church, we have people who come in the church as ambassadors of conservatism or ambassadors of progressivism. And they come in the church and they tell the pastor what he can preach about and what he shouldn't preach about based on what progressivism said or what conservatism said. They're agents or ambassadors of an ideology instead of being agents and ambassadors of God going out into the world. That's the situation we find ourselves in. Any questions about this framework, or even examples of how Christians have fallen short in this regard? Go ahead.
You know, the whole issue of side, like both sides are not really following the word. Decide to not vote, because like that is the choice that you have don't have any other, what other choice do you have?
That's what I would not advise you to do. But it's a good question, because you're saying, well, if neither side really represent God, what do? Well, you manage your expectations. I don't expect the Democrats to truly, perfectly represent God. I don't expect the Republicans to do it. That's not why I'm voting. I'm going to look at my top 5 to 10 issues and see who represents me best on that issue. It may primarily be the Democrats. That's okay. I'm not saying that because you mostly vote Democrat or Republican that you're wrong, but what I'm saying is don't expect them to represent you to the point where that's going to make you faithful. What I'm saying is if on 6 out of 10 issues they represent me best, well, guess what? On them other 4 issues, I better speak up. That's what that means. That means no Christian should be so partisan that they don't see any problem with what their side is doing. That's what I'm getting at. Please vote, please engage, but let's change our frame and expectations that we see from these 2 parties.
Justin, could you I read a few chapters in your book, and this is especially on discussing partnership between Billy Graham and Richard Nixon versus Donald Trump and Evangelical.
That's a good question. So the Billy Graham and Nixon was a very interesting relationship. They got pretty close. And unfortunately, it got to a point where Graham was defending, Nixon had lied to Graham. And he was defending him publicly and all those things, but Nixon actually wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. So it actually really hurt Graham because he became a little more political than he should have become. And that happens to a lot of us. Politicians are going to be politicians. They need us to check them, not to exalt them. And that's one thing we got to see, even in debate season, convention season, all these different things that go on with parties. Politicians need Jesus. These are people who are, if they're not checked, will become narcissistic. They'll eat themselves alive. And that's why I hate politicians coming into churches and just being celebrated and exalted. They need you. They need to come in here and know they're in a different spot. They need to be checked, not just praised. And I think even with Trump and evangelicals, what you see is an unwillingness to check someone because you're going against the people we don't like. So if you're our representative against these people that we really don't like at all, do whatever you got to do. I'm going to ignore whatever you do. I'm going to ignore your character. I'm going to ignore all that and just do what you have to do. But it ain't just on the right either. I had to check myself. Me and my wife, the last days of the Obama campaign, were out there going door to door in Florida. We drove to Florida and we're going door to door. We're in the AJC front page. We're going to door. And after I look back, I still think Obama was a good president. But when I look back, I do think the Black church made a mistake of not pushing him to do certain things and not do certain things. And I'm begging you not to make the same mistake in this election coming up. A politician may look like you, and that's great. A politician may have the best of intentions. A politician is a politician, which means they're going to be getting pushed from somebody. And if all you're doing is defending them and not pushing them, you're going to be defending somebody else's agenda. In many cases, it's going to be an agenda that does not serve the kingdom and that a Christian should not be supporting. So we have to be a little more sophisticated with that on both sides and say, yeah, I may support you, but I'm going to ask for certain things and I'm going to tell you, you better not do certain things. And we don't often do that. Again, and this is the same thing. We don't often do that because we're so focused on how bad the other side is that we don't check our side. And as a Christian, that's not acceptable. We won't critique our side because at that point, we're outside of the cult, the partisan cult. Well, if I got to be outside of it, then I just got to be outside of it. But I've got to represent more than just this party. And that's hard to see when we're only focused on the other side. When we hear all this fear mongering. And guess what? This election is big. This election is consequential. But it's not the end all be all. And it certainly shouldn't have us lay down our convictions, be quiet about our convictions because we got to get this person in. It's never worth that. Go ahead, man.
So, I understand what you're saying, but my concern for this election in particular is that Trump is an existential threat to our democracy. And so it's not like any other election in my lifetime, it seems to me. So, I don't know, can we think of it a little bit differently because it's an unusual thing?
As far as our principles?
Well, I mean.
So I guess what I'm saying, where do you think that conflicts? Where do you think what I'm saying makes it difficult because it's existential?
Well, it feels like that you're equating the two, you know, you're equating the right and the left, and I don't know, to me, there's no equating.
So let me say this. I'm not equating the two. I'm not here to tell you which side to be on. So as far as I'm concerned, there could be people on both sides.
Yeah.
So I'm not equating the two, but what I'm telling you is it doesn't matter how bad the situation is, you have to critique both. So Christians don't have to be neutral. I'm not asking you to be neutral and act like everything's all the same. I'm not telling you exactly where I stand on that, because that's not what the most important part is. But we do have to be impartial. So not neutral, but the Bible says we have to be impartial. That means we hold up the same standard to everybody. And here's what I said earlier. If I have an infection, listen. If I have an infection in my left leg and my right leg, and the infection, as you say, in my right leg is worse, do I still have to treat both? And if I just treat the right leg, guess what? That left leg is going to kill me too. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that they're equal, but I'm saying whether they're equal or not, we have to make a critique and we have to be willing to challenge them, even if we're very clear about which one we think is worse. So I hope that's helpful. Yes, ma'am.
So how do we as individuals push or not present our position or push our politician in the area that of our concern that you said, if we have 10 things and 6 are good, then we need to check them on the other.
Yeah.
How do we as individuals do that since we're here and there?
Yeah. Well, we'll get into this a little bit, but politics in a democracy isn't really done as an individual. So we all have our own public witness. But as far as national politics, it has to be done in a group. And so that's kind of what the AND campaign is for. We're saying, hey, Christians, let's come together and be able to be bipartisan on some things and push both sides to do things differently. We're not going to tell you who to vote for, right? We're going to be honest in how we critique, but you have to engage, and we talk about this in the book, you have to engage democracy as a group, because that's the only way that it works and that you really have influence. Also, we'll talk about this a little later, politics is not all national. We got to start thinking more so on the local level, so I'll get into that in the session. Excellent question, though. Thank you.
Can I ask you one?
Can we go here and then come back?
So getting back to the word evangelical, sometimes when I hear that word, I don't recognize what it means.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like it's other. Is it supposed to represent Christianity, or has it evolved into some other kind of thing that I don't recognize?
I think it's absolutely evolved to where I don't refer to myself as that. Now, if there's a group that wants to talk to me and they're evangelical, or they want to say, hey, Justin, will you join us on this? I might do it because I know the technical definition, but I don't call myself evangelical, because evangelical has gone from something that basically means you're an Orthodox Christian or you accept the Apostles' Creed, right? To something for people who don't even go to church, but it's a political label. And so for people who reject that, I don't have a problem with that. I know some people who want to preserve it. I think there's just a lot of baggage and it's been taken to a place to where it doesn't really serve its purpose. And it's a word, right? It's a word, it's a title that to your point has really been stained.
To expand on the point that you just talked about, the evangelicals, with Trump, is it a transactional issue that they got a Supreme Court who did what they want to be gotten done?
Yeah, I think for some people it was transactional. If you talk to some conservative Christians, they'll tell you it was a transaction. I don't care about his character because he did what I needed him to do. I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm saying that's how some of them looked at it. That's how some people looked at it. And that's not the first time that's happened. There are transactions that go back and forth, but I think you do have to look at character, and there's a lot of other things that play into that. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with it, but certainly there's people who looked at it that way. Any other questions? All right, we'll take another one or two, and then we'll move to the next part.
There you go.
Are you familiar with the, I guess it's a documentary called Bad Faith? I never understood.
Is it older? Is it new or older?
I'm not sure. I just recently
Sounds familiar.
looked at it, but it talks about Christian nationalism and
Oh,
everything surrounding
Yeah.
that and how it all started. But that's something I would suggest people, if you can take a look at it, you can find it on some of the streaming platforms.
yeah,
Because I couldn't understand how evangelicals could support Trump with some of the vile and nasty things that he would say and do. But that explains why they support it. And it has to do with being transactional.
yeah. And let me say this, just so everybody, you said the term Christian nationalism, but I realize everybody might not know what that means exactly. And so the idea of Christian nationalism is a few things. Number one, it starts with the assumption that America is a Christian nation, right? And let me say this, to the extent that they're saying Christianity had an influence on America, there was a Christian influence, right? But many of the founding fathers were deists. There's a lot of things that go into that. And I would certainly say it wasn't a Christian nation when you have slavery. It's not a Christian nation when you have Jim Crow, and we can go on and on and on with that, okay? So I wouldn't agree with that. The second part that it says is that because it's a Christian nation, Christianity, when it comes to policy and things of that nature, should have a privilege. So our laws and things like that should lean toward being Christian over other points of view. I think number one, that's not democratic, right? I believe that what our Constitution said, in the same way that Frederick Douglass says, it means that everybody has the opportunity to have a voice. So if my friend who is secular, my friend who's Muslim, my friend who is Hindu has an idea how this country should look, he should be able to speak. And if the merits of the case are on his side, then he should win the argument. Just because you're Christian doesn't mean you're right about a particular policy. And that's just not democratic. I would say also, lastly, that it's actually more culturally conservative than it is actually Christian, right? Number one, Christianity doesn't force people you can't force somebody to be a Christian. Right. We're not about forcing people, right? We can persuade, we can have conversations with people, but we're not about compelling people to do everything we say do. And so that's why I think Christian nationalism is very wrong-headed and very dangerous, because it's not even all that Christian at the end of the day. Yes.
We have a couple of questions in the Zoom chat.
Okay.
Just following up on a couple of statements you've made. One person asked, how do you check politicians as an individual and make it mean something? Going back to when you said to press them on policies that we need to strongly.
I give the same answer they gave the First Lady. It's hard to do that. You can write in, you can make calls. I'm not going to say that doesn't matter, but it's way more significant, way more impactful when you do it with a group. So if First Lady does it by herself, that doesn't mean they're not gonna hear her, but if she does it consistently with 10 other ladies in the church, it's gonna have a much bigger impact. Because it's just hard to do politics by yourself because you don't have a lot of influence by yourself, and that's by design, right? It's by design that you need to organize and get a group of people to show how much strength you have. Is there another one you have, and then I'll come to you?
There is one more, asking also, when you were on the topic of absence in voting, asking if you do not get a majority of policies you believe are important to you from either politician or any politician on the ballot.
If you don't get a majority, well, there's two things you can do. You can either say, well, I get more from this side, so I'll go with this side and kind of protest the things that I don't get, or I go in a different direction and vote a third party. I mean, I think those are the best, options that you have. But for the long term, I think if we work together, the beauty, and maybe it's even Providence, the beauty of it is there are Bible-believing Christians on both sides of the aisle. Can you think about if on a local and national level, we were able to say, let's disagree on this, this, and this, but we agree on these 4 things. Let's work together on these 4 things and put the partisanship aside. Imagine what we could accomplish. But guess what? The allies that we have in our party have an interest in keeping us separated.
Right.
So when you're watching Fox News or you're watching MSNBC, please remember that they have an interest in keeping you separated and showing you the worst of the other side and not letting you know that that Christian might disagree with you on some things, but there actually are reasonable people on that side that you can talk to and that you should work with and that you should build relationship with. So just something to keep in mind. Yes, sir.
Well, what I was gonna say, along the line, Ms. Carter.
When we have something that we don't agree with politically, and we're thinking and we should find a group that feels the same way we do. Sometimes we feel isolated. Oh, nobody thinks like I do. Nobody believes. But really, we do that without even exploring. Hey, maybe there is somebody that feels the way I do. And if not, well, let me start a campaign. Even where you live, let me put up flyers and see how many people feel this way. And then that's how you build a coalition. Coalitions don't come from just giving up on your idea by yourself. Coalition means there's got to be somebody else that's like-minded with me. And you find those other people. And that's how, packs grow and build up so that they have enough people to have that power to make a presentation on what they feel.
No, absolutely. And actually, that's how the ad campaign started. I can't remember which prophet. Was it Ezekiel who was asking, am I the only one? And then God showed there were others. That's basically what happened with the ad campaign. Isaiah.
Yeah, when he was on the mountain.
Yeah. So absolutely right. We got to believe it. And we have a church. So we should know that there are people in the church that are thinking similarly to us. So I think that's really good. Let me step into this second part, which is me going into, and excuse me, I'm nasal, I have a cold right now, so bear with me. But I want to talk about what the AND campaign has been going around the country talking about. We've been to Harvard Law School, we've been to churches in San Francisco, churches in Cleveland, all over the country, talking about how Christians should engage in politics in this moment. I wish I could come to you and say, if the world needs a model of how you should engage politics, all they need to do is look at American Christians and they'll know exactly what being Christ-like looks like. If I said that to you, you would know that I'd be lying. While the church should be that reflection, the church has actually brought the divides of the world into the church. We become so partisan and so opposition focused, so focused on the opposition that we'll throw away our principles and not be thinking about what our public witness looks like. One of the things that I always say, Christians should want to win. To my friend here's comment, this is not a small, this is a big deal. I'm not gonna sit up and tell you, it doesn't matter. Just read the Bible and don't worry about it. That's not what the Bible tells us. We should care and we should be engaged. right? We know it's a big deal. But even as we know how serious it is to win, we cannot put the win before our witness. Some of the biggest mistakes that Christians have made is doing whatever they had to do to win and not being worried about their public witness. Because we lose credibility and we lose the reflection of Christ in what we're doing. All right, so I want to talk to you a little bit about how we go into this election cycle constructively and faithfully, and how we come out constructive and faithfully. And really, this is less about our policy positions and all that, and it's more about a spiritual disposition. What will be your point of view about the world on November 6th if you lose? Will you still be able to encourage somebody at work the next day? Will you still be able to go to the water cooler and speak to somebody who you know voted differently than you? And can you still have grace and charity when you come to that person?
Right.
If we're honest today, we know that some of us are not prepared to treat people in that way if we lose. We know that some of us have bought in so much to the despair and the doom and gloom that we might think it's all over if we lose. But I'll tell you this, I've never met a politician, I've never met a leader, I've never met a partisan that can overturn what God has in store for us. So while this is a very important and consequential election, it is not an ultimate thing. And Christians have to be able to hold that intention. This is important, very important, it's not ultimate. And so what's ultimate is what guides what's inside of me. Can somebody know that I wanted my candidate to win and see me at work next week with a spirit of joy and be like, where in the world did that come from? Let's talk, I mean, pastors talk about it all the time. We got to have a deep, abiding joy. But we can't have a deep, abiding joy if we lose an election. So what we're trying to do is say, let's not wait till November 6th to start thinking about our spiritual disposition. And what I want to say to you too, because I know people think, man, but this is so important. You're basically asking me to be weaker. I'm not asking you to be weaker. What the civil rights movement showed us is that we can be tenacious and gracious. That's what the gospel does. Somebody from outside the world may not understand, Justin, how you telling them not to be mad and and act a certain way towards these people who are doing terrible, terrible things, because it's more effective to be tenacious and do it with grace. That's why. Not because it's less effective. But let's get into this civic revival conversation. So one thing that we know that we've already seen is that because this is such a divisive election, there may be political violence, and there already has been political violence, right? There are a lot of people, and some of them are Christians, that are just not going to accept the outcome if it's not the outcome they wanted. That's how we should react to that. So we know there may be political violence coming into this. All right. And again, we have to do more than just say we're going to do better. We have to do more than just wait till November 6th and just hope we're in the right spirit to reflect Christ for the rest of the year. We have to start thinking about the principles and the standards and the disciplines that will give us the habits to make sure we wake up on November 6th in the right spirit. Doesn't mean you can't be upset, but that should only go so far. Okay? So here are the 10 disciplines that we've been talking about. 10 disciplines. Number 1, and these are on your sheets, so you have those in front of you.
Does anyone need one? Who does not have one?
Number 1 is to see people, not political abstractions. Chloe Valdary is a thinker who talks about this really well. See people, not political abstractions. Justin, what do you mean? Everybody is more than their vote. If you look at somebody and you say, oh, they're a Trump supporter or they're a Harris supporter, and that's all you think, and then you think you know something about their life, you don't. How somebody voted, they may have terrible political opinions. How they voted is not the whole of them. The Christian value here is human dignity and the imago Dei. We are all made in the image of God. So the person that we're judging because they voted for the person we don't like is still dealing with the human condition just like you are. They're dealing with addictions. They're dealing with heartbreak. They're dealing with all kinds of insecurities. Christians can never believe we know somebody by what party they're in, by their race, by their class, or by who they voted for. In fact, there's a story that goes along with this, and it's really interesting to me. Let me go. I gotta move my. Sorry, guys, I'm having a technical difficulty due to my own fault. But there's a story that there we go. There's a story that Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor, who was one of the just an excellent preacher, and he tells a story about when he was at a conference in Texas. And he gets done speaking, he's about to leave the conference, and he calls a taxi. The taxi driver drives up, and he looks at the taxi driver, and he's like, man, I don't even want to get in the car. Because he looks at the guy, and the guy looks like the caricature of someone who some people might call, for lack of a better term, a redneck. And he's like, I'm a black preacher, I don't have time for this, I really don't want to get in, but he decides to get into the taxi already. And he talks about how he's really, like, whatever he says, I'm gonna come back at him. I'm not gonna take this. He was just ready to go at this guy. He gets into the car, and the driver looks back at him and says, did you hear what happened today? He said, what, man? What happened? And he says, they assassinated Dr. King. And he pulls over the car, and they mourn together the death of Dr. King, who was one of Proctor's friends. Never would he have ever imagined that that would be the guy to tell him and mourn with him about the death of his friend. Wow. Because he had labeled him. Mm-hmm. He had tagged him based off his identity or based off how he looked before even getting to know him. Mm-hmm. It is sinful to judge someone based on who they vote for or based on how they look. You don't know what they've been through. Amen. You don't know their testimony. But if we watch cable news all day and we listen to these talking heads that are trying to keep us separated from people, you'll think that they are everything that's evil. Start to think that your side is everything that's good. We're going to get into that too. You do not know somebody based on how they vote. Doesn't mean they're right. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but you don't know their story. You don't know what type of relationship you could have with them based on that. Politics does not make that decision for us. We know that everybody is redeemable and everyone was made in the image of God. Don't you forget that as you disagree with people and we go further into this conversation. Now, here's another one. Number 2, beware of the flaws on your side. Beware of the flaws on your side. I can guarantee you every one of us in here can name 50 of the flaws on the other side. We can recite it so easily. The question is, can we recite the flaws on our side? Or have we blinded ourselves to the flaws on the other side because they're so bad on the other side? Let's think about this. Now, we know that based on the Bible, based on the fall, Genesis, that we are all fallen. And if we are all fallen, that means that these ideologies and that these parties that were made with human hands have flaws. And if we are unable to identify those flaws, then that means we've been indoctrinated. Can somebody tell me what it means to be indoctrinated?
Made to believe.
It means that you're too easy to believe something. It means that you agree to something and start believing something without questioning it. And Christians can never take an idea from the world and just start believing it without running it through biblical scrutiny, through a biblical framework. And just like we talked about earlier, many of us have positions on moral issues that have changed, not because we ran it through biblical scrutiny, but because we didn't identify the flaws on our side. So let's do this right now. I think this is an exercise you can all do with yourselves too. We'll just do 2. Everybody should be able to write down 10 things that their side gets wrong. You don't have to do that now. We'll talk about it. This is an exercise that you can go through to make sure that you are identifying what you get wrong and that you keep that in your head even as you debate others. It should give you some humility. So can somebody give me something that the left gets wrong that Christians should not agree with? Preferably somebody who is more left-leaning. Give me something that the left gets wrong.
Judgmental.
You think the left is judgmental? In what way?
Most times we don't have enough information about certain aspects of faith. We get a snippet of it, then we form our own conclusion.
Okay. Okay. Good stuff.
So, failure to fight with that same tenacity you're talking about for a living wage.
Okay. So lack of tenacity on certain economic issues? Okay.
Yes.
What about taxes, excessive taxes?
Okay.
Got that right. Okay.
The tax issue, the threshold at which we should start raising the taxes, I think, needs to be adjusted. And then in general, the tendency for the left to want to provide public and financial assistance without accountability.
Good, good. Now let me refine this a little bit, and most of them hit this. These are things that would go against the Bible. So that could, those would be one of the, but let's think about things that a Christian, not just bad policy, but something that fundamentally is adverse to the gospel.
How about same-sex marriage?
So we got marriage. Yep, we talked about that. Good one. What'd you say?
Same-sex marriage.
No, I heard there's another.
Okay.
Gender identity.
Gender identity conversation. That's a big one. That's a third rail, right? And I don't see a lot of Christians on the left standing up and saying that's going too far. Even in Europe, if you look in Europe, they're not going as far on that stuff. A lot of European countries have said we cannot cut off a minor's genitals before they get to a certain age to make that decision for themselves. They said that doesn't make sense. In America, we haven't. And I see very few Christians on the left standing up and saying, if that's even crazy for the very secular Europeans, how in the world are we accepting of that? All right, let's take it to the other side. People who might be a little more right-leaning, if we have any, what are some things that the right gets wrong, that the Bible would say is just wrong?
Both sides get wrong. Poverty.
Poverty, okay. Immigrants.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, right?
Yeah, okay. Diversity. How about inclusion? Sometimes some of the biggest issues the American church has had is they're not including certain people. Now, here's the beauty of it. Well, we'll get to that in a little bit. We'll get to that next. So again, be aware of the flaws on your side. As you go out the other side really hard, that's fine. At least have the humility to understand that you don't get everything right either. And if we look at history, we should see that, right? We often advocate as if we want absolute power for one side. But if I look at history, neither side is fit to steward absolute power. Be very careful how you advocate it and what you're saying. Next one, identify the virtue, on the other side. Are there any things on the other side that they do better than your side does? I would ask you to meditate on that a little bit before you make a statement. You might just be wrong. And the Christian values here are charity and grace. Charity and grace. Finding the virtue on the other side. And here's why I say think about that for a little bit. Because I do recall in Luke where there was certain Pharisee and he was praying. And as that Pharisee was praying, he was saying, thank God I'm not like him. And he was talking about a tax collector. Now, tax collectors were bad. These are people who put people in debt slavery. They manipulated and oppressed their own people. But when they both went to pray, and the Pharisee said, thank God I'm not like him, the Bible says, not me, the Bible says that it was the Pharisee who was saved on that day. I mean, I'm sorry, it was the tax collector who was saved on that day.
Right.
It wasn't the Pharisee. So we have to be very careful exalting ourselves to the point where we got everything right and the other side gets everything wrong.
Right.
And here's even another thing for Christians to understand. You do know that Christians, while we do have a book that has the truth in it, that Christians, the people, we don't get everything right either.
Amen. Right.
That we have to listen to other people and hear other people out. That we need to hear. Now, we don't want to agree with anything that's outside the word, but God did not give us all the answers to everything. And especially in a democracy, we need to listen to other people and hear them out. So take a minute, if that's okay with Pastor, and think about, identify the virtue on the other side. The virtue on the other side. What principle, even if you disagree with the full conclusion, what principles from the other side can you say we could do better?
I'm quite certain they don't need 2 minutes for this one, right?
Not at all.
Find out. We'll find out.
Two things they don't have flaws. Not the
And as you write, if you haven't figured it out, I am indeed trying to make you a little bit uncomfortable on your side. I want you to question what's going on your side, because that's what we want the other side to do, right? Question. Why don't they question these things? Why aren't they more critical? Why are we being critical? Are we thinking through the issue? "30 seconds. And again, we can finish up this exercise. Go on. All right, guys. So I want to repeat what we're saying here is not that you agree with the other side's conclusions, or again that this is a false equivalence. But I think we're in trouble if we can't see anything that other people say that might be right, that we need to listen to. All right. So let's see what virtue, what principles can we pull from the other side of the aisle that might be helpful to us and that we can do better. Did you raise your hand? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought sister right there raised. Yeah. Okay, go ahead, bro.
That the family is a cornerstone of a thriving society as ordained by God.
Okay. The importance of family. What's something else? Right here. Oh.
say if you're in the in-group forgiveness, because you've seen that somebody on the other side, they may fail, they may do wrong, but members of that group will say, we'll pick them right back up and put them right back on the horse and send them on their way, regardless of how vile or unreliable they are. They've just been allowed to be forgiven because they're part of that in-group.
Well, let's hope they're doing that for the right reason, for us to take it from them, but yeah, but I see where you're coming from. I see where you're. Any other thoughts? Is there anybody that thinks there's nothing that they can, no principle they can get from the other side? Because I can name some. Let's go.
Well, one that was mentioned for the other side, that our side gets wrong, but similarly, marriage and the definition of marriage, I think that the right gets that more right than their lack of tolerance for the expansion. When you look at the Christian principles and what it says in the Bible about what a marriage is, and who is between, they get that right more than we do.
Okay.
I believe the other side get this part right, if it is true, to have our resources to be reimbursed for our resources.
Okay. Okay.
They stick together no matter what, right or wrong.
Okay. Anybody else? Anybody that think there's nothing, no principle, no nothing that you can pull? Okay. And if that's the case, I think one of these next ones will help you out with that too. All right. Let's go to the next principle, which is practicing public grace and courtesy. Practicing public grace and courtesy. One of the things I lament about how we engage each other today is that there's been this misconception that the more angry and mean you are, the more effective you are. In fact, we like to listen to the people who talk the worst about the other side. Let's be honest. We like to listen to folks who say to me who are the best at critiquing and getting under the skin of the other side. Sometimes we even think what makes you the most passionate is if you have these public temper tantrums. But when I look at our society and I look at what type of government we have, that's actually not a very good way to get anything done. So we get to vent, we get to get mad, we get to make this show of things, but we haven't convinced one person. I have yet to see a case where calling somebody names, telling them how stupid they are, has changed their mind. Most of that is for show. Most of that is for your entertainment. But if you really care about an issue and you really care about the people being hurt by that issue, you actually might talk to the other side like you have some sense, because when you do, you might actually persuade them. And even if you don't persuade them, when you talk to somebody, and you can do this tenaciously, but when you talk to somebody with respect, you glorify God. When we do not show public grace, we are not relating to people and engaging in a way that can glorify God. When we share the words of people or repeat people or share their information on social media who treat people without grace, then we're doing the same thing. And let me tell you something that's so odd to me. So many people talk about how bad Trump talks about other people, and I think you're absolutely right. And for some reason, the people who like him the least started doing the same thing as he does. They started doing, now on TV, everybody's cursing. And all our favorite commentators, they'll curse on, they'll do all these things, and their language has become more like him, even though they say they don't want to be like him. Do you see how this stuff is? This is what this is the type of things that the wisdom and the moral knowledge of the civil rights movement saw. When you hate somebody that bad and you don't keep your convictions and principles next to you, you become like them. This is what they knew. How did we lose in a generation? How did we lose that understanding? When you treat people with courtesy and grace, that doesn't mean that you can't look them in the eye and demand your rights. It just means you can see that they are redeemable and that regardless of how they act, you need to treat them a certain way, not because they deserve it, but because of who you represent. But again and again, we listen to the wrong people and they pull us into this mindset that we can treat others any kind of way. We should know better than that. That's not the truth. Next one. This is number 4, I believe. Is it 5? Losing track. This is number 5. All right. Exercise media hygiene. Exercise. Y'all gonna be mad at me. Some of y'all might already be mad at me. That's okay. You're really gonna be mad at me after this one. There's this thing called confirmation bias. And what confirmation bias says is that we like to get information from people who already agree with us. In fact, we like to get information and hear things that just affirm what we already thought. That's what makes us feel, it actually gives us a good feeling to say, let me turn this on and let me hear my favorite talking head repeat exactly what I want to hear. And usually it's negative and mean or tell them how great we are and how terrible the other side is all the time, right? We all, and it's something we all have to be aware of and that we all have to fight, okay? What media hygiene is saying is that you have to watch where you get your information. Because if you get your information out of the trash, then your opinion will be trash. You will have bad media hygiene. If you only listen to people who tell you what you want to hear, you will not be informed. You will be misinformed. And this is coming from me, this is not coming from Pastor. I'm gonna say this, and I mean it, and I want everybody to think about it. If you get all your information or most of your information from Fox News or MSNBC, then you are misinformed. Because they're not giving you the best of both sides of the argument. And this is not about agreeing with the other side. It's about recognizing that there are people who work in good faith and who are intelligent that disagree with you. They may be very wrong, but unless you're listening to the best argument from the other side, you don't know the argument and you don't know the issue. So each one of us, if we lean left, we should be able to name 5 people on the other side. And I'm not talking about these folks that they bring on who act like they're conservative or progressive, but they really just agree with the other side. I'm not talking about that. If you're on the left, you should know at least 5 people on the right, writers, thinkers, who you respect. You don't have to agree with them, who you can say they are intelligent and they're working in good faith, and vice versa. If we cannot do that, then I question our media hygiene. I question whether we're really seeing both sides of the argument. Everybody on the other side is not just malicious. Everybody on the other side is not just motivated by their hatred for you. Now, there may be some, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there aren't some and that we can't identify them and call them out. Please do. But the moment that you believe it's everybody, you've been tricked. And so we have to look at our media hygiene. What is our intake of information? Where is it coming from? And how does it impact what comes out? What's the output from what we've been taking in? All right. Next, have an affirmative posture. Have an affirmative posture. One of the criticisms, and I think it's a fair criticism of Christianity, is that we talk a lot about what we're against, but don't talk a lot about what we're for.
Amen.
We talk a lot about what the world is doing wrong and all this stuff, but not about what we'll do to make things right. And we know that we're supposed to be the light, right? That we're supposed to be fruitful. So we have to start thinking things through in a much different way, right? And here, let me say this also. We need to have a positive vision to be more complete. And here's what I want to tell you. We tend to think that fighting against something wrong automatically makes us right. That fighting against something wrong automatically makes us right. But let me tell you something. You can fight against something that's wrong and still be wrong. You can fight against something that's wrong and still be wrong. Why? Because a good cause is never enough. You have to have a positive spirit with that cause. We can go through history, and I can point out through history, a lot of the most evil people in history did not start off with a bad cause. Let's take Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin came from a group of people who were being terribly oppressed in Georgia and Europe, terribly oppressed. And he grew up in the church and worked hard, and he wanted to fight against the people that were oppressing him. He was a social justice fighter because his people were being treated awfully. And one day he decided that Christian principles weren't enough for him to fight the way he wanted to fight. And so when he actually succeeded and got into power, he became one of the most evil men in the world, in world history. Because he decided that he would be evil to fight evil. So that's part of the point that we've been saying this whole time. You may see something negative on the other side. To fight against that isn't enough. It's how you fight against it. I'm not up here telling you to let evil go and that it's not a big deal. What I'm telling you is just like the civil rights movement, how you do it matters. And you cannot do it the way that secular people do everything. You have a different set of standards. All right, let's keep it moving. This is a good one. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final and most essential command. The party told you that the election was stolen, even though there was no evidence to show that, and you just went along with it. The party told you that men and women were interchangeable. And because the other side was so bad, you just went along with it. There are absurd assertions on both sides of the aisle. It doesn't mean that they're equal or that there's an equal number of them. And Christians have accepted some of the things that we know are wrong. We got to think through that. We have to be able to discern partisan talking points. What is a partisan? A partisan is someone who represents a party. A partisan is someone who, by definition, is not objective. Their job is not to just give you the facts. Their job is to persuade you to go a certain way. When I go to a football game, I do not listen to the cheerleaders to tell me exactly who the best team is. I already know what the cheerleaders are going to say. When we get information from certain people who are very clearly on one side, it doesn't mean that you can't listen to them. It means you need to have the discernment and wisdom to understand that they're coming from one side. And one of the things that happens, and one of the things that is just unfortunate is when a Christian leader gets on a platform or gets in the pulpit and just repeats partisan talking points. And I see it all the time. It's as if they've just watched one of these talk shows and they just repeat what they heard as if it's facts, but it's actually just a talking point. It actually comes from a partisan who's not just giving you the straight up truth. They're mixing the truth in with a lot of other things, okay? We have to be able to discern partisan talking points. Is the person talking to me someone who is just giving me the facts or someone who's trying to persuade me? Next, and this one should be fairly simple, but I don't know that we do it the right way. Pray for your political opponents. Pray for your political opponent. It's hard for you to hate somebody that you actually pray for. Again, it doesn't mean that you have to act like what they do is right. Pray for your political opponents. I'm not just talking about imprecatory prayers where you ask fire to be rained down on their head. I'm not talking about that. Pray sincerely for your political opponents. Maybe it's for their redemption. Maybe it's for a number of things, but that's a good practice. That's a good discipline for our hearts. Because we can become so bitter. I looked at myself when I said, wow, I'm so bitter. And this bitterness is doing nothing for me. It's hurting me. It's not hurting the person I hate. It's hurting me. Get involved. Get involved. And here's what I was saying a little bit earlier. We're on the last two. Get involved. They used to say that all politics were local. Now, all politics seem national. And when we talk about politics, we're usually talking about a national election. Because for some reason, we feel like our whole public witness is pushed into this. When the truth is, national politics is very important, but the impact that it has on us in a lot of areas is really indirect. Our public witness is more than just that national vote. It's the local things we do as well. And here's what I want to say to y'all who's politician, whatever presidential candidate you're pushing may lose. Here's what I want to say to you to give you some hope. You and your church, if you are diligent and caring, can have a greater impact on the community around you than whoever gets in office on November 6th. There's a reason to be hopeful. Yes, the person that's going in is going to be one of the most powerful people in the world. They don't control everything. You and your church can have a greater impact on some things than they do. Don't give up. There's a reason to be hopeful, and somebody still needs you to advocate for them. And if you're bitter or you're hopeless, you can't do that. So for no other reason other than being faithful, for no other reason, keep a spirit that is hopeful and joyful, because you know you still have people you have to advocate for. And you have to do it persuasively, and you have to do it tenaciously, and you have to do it graciously. And you can't do that if your spirit's not in the right place. You do and can still have an impact. Do not forget that. And lastly, commit to moving forward constructively. If I lose on November 6th, and I wake up on November 6th, can I still work with people who disagree with me? Can I still tell them I love them? Can I accept the result? Or is everybody who gives me some idea or some conspiracy, am I going to listen to them and run off down this rabbit hole? Commit to moving forward constructively. Rev, do you want to do some more questions, or you want to end it? It's up to you.
Yeah, you got, yeah, let's give a few minutes for some Q&A.
So that's my presentation. If there's any Q&A, I'm happy to stand in and just answer some of your questions. Sure.
Let's take a few minutes and I know some of you came here with some questions, so don't take them home with you. All right, we brought them in. All right, so we got Sister Walker right here first. Who's gonna be second? All right, Fred's gonna be second, okay? All right, go ahead, Sister Walker.
So I want to step back to, the information you gave about looking at the issues and seeing, you got 4 over here you can deal with, and there's some more you really can.
Yes, ma'am.
I find it very difficult, to be perfectly honest. If, let's say for instance, I may not agree with abortion. But at the same time, having worked at an OBGYN office, I have seen some things that I would not have seen as far as healthcare is concerned for women who are carrying pregnancy and all other issues that come with taking care of the female body.
Absolutely.
So I saw some things, as I said, but I don't hear anybody really addressing those issues that a patient would need the doctors to really help her through some very difficult times. I don't see how we can paint it with all with the same brush. And if that's something that I'm really concerned about, where in there am I supposed to reconcile my vote? If I have an issue with something that's so personal, am I betraying my faith? Or am I missing something?
I hear you. I just want to let you.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll stop.
I think I hear your heart. I think I hear your heart.
'Cause I could keep going, but I stop.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, let me say this, and I hope it didn't sound like I suggested this, but I actually speak against one issue voting. Right, that's why I say create the list. So I don't feel like, if you think that's a complicated issue, and I tend to be somebody who says, yeah, let the issue be complicated. I think one thing that we see, especially with the abortion issue, is we see a black and white. We see completely wrong, don't do it, that's the end of the conversation. And we see it's just a woman's choice, that's the end of the conversation. I do think it's a little more complicated than both of those, right? This is very personal for a woman. It's something that's connected to her body. The process can take her life. It's not just as simple as saying no. Most women that have abortions do so because they say that they can't afford to have a baby. So it's not just because I don't care. Most women say I can't afford to do it. Does it make it right? Not necessarily, but it's not an easy issue. Number one, okay? At the same time, for a Christian, the far left stance, which says the baby doesn't matter. It's not even a consideration. So if I say my body, my choice, I would, if it was just about one body, it's an easy conversation. I don't think Christians can say there's nothing else there and that what's there doesn't have value. So let's allow this to be a complicated situation. We know that God values life. We know that life is sacred. So we can't look at it and say, it doesn't matter, just push it away. But can we also look at the mother and just ignore her issue? Can I say I'm pro-life and then not take care of anything about childcare, not care anything about what happens after birth? I would say that's pro-birth. I wouldn't say that's pro-life, right? So I think Christians can look at this in a more complicated way. I'm not here to tell you exactly where to come down on it, but I am here to tell you, if you take the right word view of it, where it's just no, don't do it, that's the end of the conversation, too simplistic. It's just a woman and her body, there's nothing else even there on the left. That's too simplistic, it's not true. But we will allow talking points as Christians to bring us into one of those two positions when we should be standing up. Now, for me, I felt better, even though I wasn't fully agreeing with it, when the Democrats said safe, legal, and rare. Right? Because at least they were saying this is not something that's good. It may be necessary in certain situations, and we can disagree on that, but let's all agree it's not something that we want to happen a lot. Well, when I was at the Democratic National Convention in 2020, it completely changed. And they were saying celebrate the abortion and all that. Guess what? That could have been a time where Christians that were Democrats stepped up and say, no, that's going too far. Don't do that. We didn't do that because they do what they always do. Well, look how bad they are. Don't start a scene because they're worse. Christians have to find that space. On abortion, for me, I don't think it should be the only issue we vote. That's my opinion. I also don't think we can fall in one of those two simplifications of the issue. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
We'll take one more. Go ahead.
So earlier you said that we have a voice when we speak together. And I was wondering, how do we get access to being heard as we speak together? So if we have a large group, whether it's through our church or through our organizations that we belong to, when we have a group, how do we know what the vehicle is or who to speak to as the group, or what the talking point is as a group to be heard?
Yep. So first, it depends on what the issue is, right? So depending on the issue, you first have to do your homework. So you got to come together in a group and say, okay, what part of the government controls this issue? If it's a local school issue and I go to somebody in state government that deals with something completely different, I didn't do my due diligence to make sure that we were being put in a good position. Folks need to sit down and say, okay, who do we need to speak to make the change? And then you have to come up with a strategy on how to do that. Let's say it's a local school issue and you're saying, hey, some of these books that are just not appropriate for kids. I don't want my second graders seeing some of the stuff that's in that particular book. Well, then you would go to the school board, and if you went to the school board consistently, they would hear you out. Now, I'm not going to say the change would be easy, but people don't realize if you go to a school board, a city council with 10 people, 5 people over and over again, and they can guarantee, and they know they're going to see you again, they're going to listen to you because they know you're truly engaged. What we do is we think advocacy is glamorous. We go for a couple of weeks, nothing changes, and we stop. That's not what the people who actually control the policy do. They stay on it. So it takes due diligence. You have to identify the issue, identify where the authority on that issue is, and then kind of go from there with your strategy. Yeah.
Justin, thank you for coming. We appreciate the context and I guess what you said, it's in your wheelhouse, your knowledge. I have 3 questions. I'm going to give you the easy ones first.
No, you're just gonna give them one of those 3. Just one. So take your best.
I saw some of your questions earlier. Once you get out, I mean, if you follow our content, you get some of those other ones answered. You will.
Okay, well, let me start with the hard one.
All right.
Back in, I think it was 21, President Obama talked about a more perfect union. And he got into trouble with some of the reporters about Jeremiah Wright.
Yes.
Can you discuss that?
Oh, sure. Okay. So during that campaign, well, let me back up. Jeremiah Wright had made a statement, or there was a video of Jeremiah Wright saying, somebody says, God bless America, I say, GD America. Basically saying, we've done some things that were reprehensible, and we need to say, not only has God, not only have we done good things, there's things that we should be held accountable. Conservatives kind of got a hold of that, and they used it against Obama because that was his pastor. And they kind of used it against him because I think a lot of people had never heard something like that said from a pulpit before. And so they're, oh my. And that's just what happens, right? They bring people that you're close to that, something was said, and they kind of go back and forth on that. And I don't know if it's right to say Obama threw him up, but Obama definitely separated himself from Jeremiah right at that moment. And practically speaking, some would say that he had to. I mean, that's a judgment call, but that's kind of what happened. And it goes back to your earlier question on the relationship between clergy and politicians. And a lot of politicians, not everybody, they're going to do what's in the best interest of their campaign. So as we engage politicians, we can love them, edify them, whatever. Keep in mind that they're politicians. Politicians will use the church. And then when the church becomes somewhat of a liability to their political prospects, they'll also push it aside. And that's not everybody, but many politicians will do that. That's just the nature of the game, unfortunately.
All right, let's get. We got we got one online question, so we're gonna let Alan hit the one online, and then we're gonna wrap it up. Because I see some of y'all, we don't want you to fall asleep on the way home. All right.
Person in the chat, I'm gonna do my best to interpret exactly from what they said. They asked, would you please provide examples of what being unfaithful to God looks like? And I am speculating here that it is within the political arena.
Yeah. So I think if you are a Republican and you're around a group of Republicans, or you're somewhere and let's say they start talking very negatively about immigrants, calling them out their names, making accusations that are racist and all that. If you sit there and laugh and go along with it, I would say that's unfaithful. If you are a Democrat and you are in a conversation or you're around some other Democrats that are talking about something like gender identity, and they're going as far left as they can possibly go and pretending that men and women are interchangeable. And let me say this on that issue. I do believe that people are really struggling with these things. So I think the church needs to have a lot of compassion, and a lot more compassion than we've had.
Amen.
So I want to be very clear on that. And I don't think the right gets that issue right either. But I don't think we're helping children by confusing them and telling them there's something they're not. A lot more children are suffering from that now because it's being introduced to them on social media and other spaces as if it's okay. So now anything they struggle with, they're thinking, oh, I must be in the wrong body. If you are a Democrat and you just go along with that and have nothing to say, to me, that is unfaithful. And that is getting people hurt, just like the other thing is getting people hurt. Can we be distinctive? Can we draw a line that our party doesn't necessarily want us to draw? If we don't do that, then I would say we've been unfaithful.